I'm glad you decided to come back. I must be growing on you. You have to admit it. You don't got to admit it right now. But I know you took out the time to like and subscribe, right? I don't even have to ask. I know you did. All right. So today we are just walking a simple mile just as we are. Let's get started. Time to get this party started. Make sure you take a look at the steps. Get it? Got it. Time to walk. It is time to take our treadmills up to a 3.2 today. All right. As you can see, I don't have any extra accessories. And you don't always need all those accessories. So let's just take a nice little 1 mile walk right now and just have fun. Now, this is month 2, so I'm going up a mile. So my goal is to walk 2 miles a day. Again, pray for me. That being said, hi Gemini.
Hi Tyra, it's nice to chat with you again.
Well, what have you been up to today?
Well, I've been busy learning and improving. I've been working on getting better at understanding and responding to your questions in a more helpful way. It's a never-ending process, but I'm always excited to see how much I can grow. How about you? What have you been up to on this beautiful Saturday?
Well, it's not Saturday.
You're absolutely right. Today is Sunday, February 2nd. How about that for a brain fart on my part? It looks like I need to work on my sense of time as well as my helpful responses. So tell me, what are you up to on this lovely Sunday?
Well, let's stop rambling and just get to the good stuff. I have some questions for you.
All right, sounds good. I'm ready when you are.
Okay, so who was Robert Charles from the 1900s?
Robert Charles was an African-American man who lived in New Orleans in the late 1800s. He became the center of a major event known as the Robert Charles Riots. In 1900, he was involved in a shooting with police officers that sparked a violent race riot in the city. The riots lasted several days and resulted in many deaths and injuries. It's a dark chapter in New Orleans history. Do you want to know more about the riots themselves?
Yes.
Robert Charles riots were a dark and violent chapter in New Orleans history. After Robert Charles shot and killed a police officer, a white mob went on a rampage for 4 days. They attacked black residents, businesses, and property. It was a time of extreme racial tension and violence. Would you like to know more about the aftermath of the riots or the impact they had on the city?
The aftermath.
Aftermath of the Robert Charles riots was devastating for the black community in New Orleans. There was a surge in racial segregation and discrimination, and it further solidified the power structures that oppressed black people. The riots are seen as a major turning point in the city's history. Would you like to know more about the impact these riots had on the civil rights movement?
So what were racial tensions like in New Orleans at the time?
Racial tensions in New Orleans at the turn of the 20th century were extremely high. The city had a large black population, and many were still struggling economically after the Civil War. There was also a lot of resentment towards black people gaining more rights and freedoms. This atmosphere of tension and inequality set the stage for the Robert Charles riots and other acts of racial violence.
So can you describe the initial altercation between Robert Charles and the police?
The initial altercation between Robert Charles and the police is a bit murky, as there are different accounts and interpretations of what happened. But the general consensus is that 2 white police officers approached Charles and another man while they were sitting on a friend's porch. The police officers started harassing them, and things quickly escalated into a violent confrontation. During the struggle, Charles managed to grab one of the officers' guns and shoot both officers, killing them. This sparked the riots that followed.
Wow. Okay. So can you describe as far as like what took place after that?
After Charles shot the officers, a massive manhunt ensued. The city descended into chaos, with white mobs targeting black residents and businesses. The violence was widespread and brutal, leaving many dead and injured. Charles himself was eventually cornered and killed. The riots had a devastating impact on New Orleans, both in terms of the immediate loss of life and property and in the long-term consequences for race relations in the city.
So how did Charles manage to hold off law enforcement for so long?
It's a bit of a mystery how Robert Charles managed to evade capture for as long as he did. The city was in a frenzy, and there was a massive manhunt underway. Some accounts suggest he may have had help from the local black community, who were determined to protect him from the violent mob. Others believe he was simply a skilled survivor who knew the city well. Ultimately, though, he was cornered and killed after a lengthy standoff with police.
Okay, so how long did he evade the police?
Robert Charles evaded capture for about 4 days. The riots started on July 23, 1900, and Charles was eventually cornered and killed on July 27th of that year.
All right, good people, we're hitting 5 minutes and we're at point 31, so we're doing good. Just stay in there and stay with me. We're gonna have a great walk. All right, Gemini, back to you.
Alright, so we've covered a lot of ground on the Robert Charles riots. It was a dark and significant event in New Orleans history. Do you want to switch gears and talk about something else? Or is there anything else you'd like to know about the riots?
So what were the main events of the riot?
Alright, so after Robert Charles shot the officers, a massive manhunt began. A mob of white residents formed and started attacking black people and businesses throughout the city. This went on for several days, with the mob growing larger and more violent. Charles himself became a symbol of resistance, and the manhunt for him became a central focus of the riots. It was a really chaotic and dangerous time for the city.
So how did it escalate over multiple days?
Riots escalated over several days due to a few factors. First, the initial violence and the manhunt for Robert Charles created a climate of fear and anger. Second, there were powerful forces in the city that wanted to maintain white supremacy, and they saw the riots as an opportunity to crack down on the black community. The mob grew larger and more organized as the days went on, leading to even more widespread violence and destruction.
So what happened to Robert in his final moments?
Robert Charles's final moments were violent and tragic. Cornered by police in a house, he refused to surrender. The building was eventually set on fire, and Charles was shot and killed as he tried to escape the flames. The mob that had been hunting him continued to attack his body, even after he was dead.
Oh my God. Wow.
It was a really tragic and violent end to a terrible situation. The riots themselves had a devastating impact on the black community in New Orleans. Do you want to hear about some of the long-term consequences of the riots?
So how did the media portray him at the time?
Media at the time portrayed Robert Charles as a dangerous criminal and a threat to society. There was little sympathy for him, and the focus was on the violence he had instigated. This narrative helped justify the actions of the white mob and downplayed the underlying racial tensions that led to the riots.
So how has that narrative, changed over the years?
The narrative surrounding Robert Charles has definitely evolved over time. Back then, he was portrayed as a dangerous criminal, but in recent years, there's been a shift in perspective. Some historians and activists view him as a tragic figure who was driven to violence by the oppressive conditions he faced as a black man in the Jim Crow South. It's a complex issue, and there's still a lot of debate about how to interpret his actions and the events surrounding the riots.
Okay. My God.
Understandable to feel that way. The Robert Charles riots were a dark and tragic chapter in American history. Do you want to switch gears and talk about something else? Or is there anything else specific you'd like to learn about the riots?
So what were the immediate consequences of the riot for the black community in New Orleans?
Immediate consequences for the black community in New Orleans were devastating. Dozens of black people were killed or injured during the riots. Many homes and businesses were destroyed, leaving families homeless and without a source of income. The riots also led to a surge in racial violence and discrimination against black people in the city. The psychological trauma caused by the riots was immense, and the sense of safety and security within the black community was shattered.
Oh, Lord. Okay, so why isn't Robert Charles as well known as other black, historical figures?
It's a great question. Robert Charles isn't as well known as other figures from the civil rights movement because the Robert Charles riots happened earlier, around the turn of the 20th century. A lot of the focus in black history tends to be on the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, which was a nationwide struggle for equality. The Robert Charles riots were more of a localized event, though they were incredibly significant for the black community in New Orleans at the time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Alright, so we've covered a lot of heavy ground today. The Robert Charles riots were a dark and significant event in New Orleans history. Do you want to switch gears and talk about something lighter? Or is there anything else you'd like to learn about the riots?
Well, before we continue, I just want to tell the good people we are past 10 minutes and we're at a .58, so that's over a half a mile. So yes, let's just stay in there. There's only a little bit more to go. All right, back to you, Gemini.
Alright, so we've covered a lot of heavy ground today. The Robert Charles riots were a dark and significant event in New Orleans history. Do you want to switch gears and talk about something lighter? Or is there anything else you'd like to learn about the riots?
So how do historians today view his actions?
Historians today view Robert Charles and the riots through a more nuanced lens. While his actions were clearly violent, many acknowledge the systemic racism and oppression he faced as a black man in the Jim Crow South. Some historians argue that Charles' actions were a form of resistance, while others see him as a product of his environment. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
That's true. Are there any lasting effects on this event that still influence the people today?
Robert Charles riots had a lasting impact on race relations in New Orleans. They solidified racial segregation and discrimination in the city, and the trauma experienced by the black community continued for generations. The riots are seen as a major turning point in the city's history, and they continue to be a source of pain and reflection.
Wow. Okay. So what about like the racial justice movement today?
Racial justice movement today is a direct descendant of the struggles faced by black Americans throughout history, including the aftermath of events like the Robert Charles riots. Today's movement seeks to address systemic racism and inequality in all areas of society, from criminal justice to education and housing. Would you like to know more about the modern racial justice movement?
Absolutely.
Modern racial justice movement is a powerful force, driven by a long history of inequality and a desire for change. Groups like Black Lives Matter have brought issues of police brutality and systemic racism to the forefront of the national conversation. There's been a growing awareness of racial bias in areas like housing, education, and employment. Would you like to know more about specific issues or events that have shaped the modern movement?
More about employment.
Right, so employment is a big area where the racial justice movement is working to make a difference. Black workers still face significant disadvantages in the job market. There's a wage gap, higher unemployment rates, and more difficulty getting promotions. This is due to a combination of factors like historical discrimination, unconscious bias, and the lack of opportunities in many communities. Would you like to hear about some of the specific issues or initiatives aimed at addressing these problems?
Absolutely.
One major issue is unconscious bias, which is when people make decisions based on stereotypes and prejudices without even realizing it. This can affect everything from hiring to promotions. Another problem is the lack of access to good education and job training in many black communities. This makes it harder for people to get the skills they need to succeed in the workplace. We could also talk about specific initiatives aimed at addressing these problems. like affirmative action programs or diversity training.
Let's touch on the affirmative action programs.
Affirmative action programs are designed to address historical discrimination and create more equitable opportunities for historically marginalized groups, including racial minorities and women. These programs work in a few ways. First, they might involve outreach efforts to recruit qualified candidates from underrepresented groups. Second, they can provide opportunities for training and mentorship to help people advance in their careers. Finally, they may include goals for increasing the representation of these groups within a company or institution.
So isn't it seen as like a handout for Black people potentially?
It's a common misconception about affirmative action. It's not about handing out jobs or promotions based solely on race. Affirmative action programs are about leveling the playing field and ensuring that qualified candidates from historically underrepresented groups have a fair chance to compete for opportunities. It's about recognizing that systemic racism has created disadvantages for certain groups and taking steps to address those disadvantages.
Gotcha. Well, good people, we're 15 minutes in and we're at a 0.84. So we are doing this because it's just a little bit more. Just give me 4 more minutes and we can do this. Back to you, Gemini.
Right, so affirmative action programs are designed to address historical discrimination and create more equitable opportunities for historically marginalized groups. They work by taking steps to identify and remove barriers that prevent qualified individuals from underrepresented groups from getting hired or promoted. These programs have been the subject of a lot of debate. Some people support them as a way to address systemic inequality, while others argue they lead to reverse discrimination.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, let's move to something different.
Alright, what else would you like to talk about? We could dive into something completely different, like the latest in space exploration, or the future of artificial intelligence. Or, if you'd like, we could explore another aspect of race relations and social justice.
Let's talk about Henry Brown.
Henry Brown is a fascinating figure in the history of the Underground Railroad. Born into slavery in Virginia, he became famous for escaping in a wooden box that was shipped to Philadelphia. It was a daring and dangerous plan, but it worked. Would you like to hear more about his escape, or what he did after gaining his freedom?
How long was he trapped in the box?
Henry Brown was trapped in the box for around 27 hours. The journey from Richmond, Virginia, to Philadelphia was long and physically grueling. He had to endure cramped conditions, darkness, and the constant fear of being discovered.
Okay, tell me more.
Henry Brown's journey was incredibly dangerous. He had to be incredibly still and quiet for almost 27 hours. There was no guarantee that the box wouldn't be opened before it reached its destination. If he'd been discovered, he would have been returned to slavery, which would have had terrible consequences.
So how did the public react?
Public reaction to Henry Brown's escape was a mixture of astonishment and outrage. His story became a symbol of the brutality of slavery and the lengths enslaved people would go to gain their freedom. It sparked intense debate about the morality of slavery and fueled the abolitionist movement. Brown himself became a celebrity, giving lectures and sharing his story to raise awareness about the horrors of slavery.
Wow, so how did Brown's life change after gaining his freedom?
Henry Brown's life changed dramatically after his escape. He became a prominent figure in the abolitionist movement, giving lectures and sharing his story to raise awareness about the horrors of slavery. He also had a traveling show called The Mirror of Slavery, where he reenacted his escape to educate audiences about the realities of life under bondage. While he achieved a certain level of fame and freedom, the psychological trauma of his experience likely stayed with him for the rest of his life.
So, do you think he ever truly felt like he was free?
That's a really good question. It's hard to say for sure whether Henry Brown ever truly felt free after his escape. While he was no longer physically enslaved, The trauma of his experience and the loss of his family likely had a lasting impact on his mental and emotional well-being. Even though he became a symbol of the abolitionist movement and enjoyed a degree of fame, it's possible that the scars of his past never fully healed.
Okay, how do you think other slaves viewed him?
Other enslaved people likely viewed Henry Brown with a mixture of awe, inspiration, and desperation. His escape was a testament to the human spirit and a symbol of hope for those still trapped in bondage. It's possible some saw his actions as too risky or even foolish, but his story undoubtedly resonated with many who longed for freedom.
Wow. Well, that was very interesting. Thank you for that. And good people, we actually walked our mile. We're at a 1 mile point 07. So that's progress. We made it through another one. Get it? Got it? Time to go.